Good afternoon, mesdames et messieurs, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to start our second plenary address into the maelstrom, the issues of Masonic regularity, past and present. It is my great pleasure and honor to introduce our keynote speaker as well as the distinguished discussant today. I will introduce them first, and then we will start with the presentations, and we will have questions at the end. Dr. John L. Cooper III was Grand Master of the Masonic Grand Lodge of California in 2013-2014, and in 2014 served as chairman of the Conference of Grand Masters of Masons in North America. He served for 18 years as the Grand Secretary of the Grand Lodge of California, where he was responsible for the Masonic foreign relations of the Grand Lodge, and also he participated as a president of the Council of Grand Secretaries. Dr. Cooper has a master's degree in political science from the University of California, Los Angeles, and a PhD in education from Claremont Graduate University in California. His primary interest in Freemasonry is in the political and social context within which Freemasonry exists and in the foundational milieu within which Freemasonry operates. He is currently the president of the Institute for Masonic Studies, which proudly sponsors the UCLA program Freemasonry and Civil Society under the leadership of Professor Margaret Jacob. His paper today, as I mentioned before, Into the Maelstrom, Issues of Masonic Regularity and Recognition, Past and Present, will be discussed after his intervention by Monsieur Alain Bauer. He, as many of you know, particularly in France and all over the world, Mr. Bauer is very well known, so I will try to be loyal to what Wikipedia said about him, that he told me that he, every time that someone introduces him, he learns something about himself. And he was elected professor of criminology at the National Conservatory for the Arts and Crafts and a senior research fellow at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York City, and the University of Law and Political Science in China, particularly in Beijing. He has worked as a criminologist at the Sorbonne University, at the National Police Academy and the National Justice Academy, as well as he has his senior research fellow at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. He was a Grand Master of the Grand Orient de France from 2000 to 2003, Chancellor of the International Masonic Institute since 2003, and also author of numerous hundreds of publications. In fact, we just brought from the United States his most current publication that is titled Freemasonry, a French View, with Dr. Roger Rocher. It's a great read that you might see tomorrow because we brought some copies. So without further ado, it is my great honor to introduce these great gentlemen, Dr. John Cooper and Mr. Alain Bauer.
I thought I was set up with this when they showed at lunch the Inspector Morse movie, Masonic Mysteries, and they shut it down just before the end of the movie. So if you want to see the ending, you will have to get the DVD. It's worth doing, I should think. It's also a pleasure to share this platform and be introduced by Dr. Guillermo. We've been friends since he first sought out our Grand Lodge for research many years back now, and I've followed his career academically with very great interest and great achievements in what he's done. I've also had the pleasure of knowing Most Worshipful Brother Alain Bauer since 2002 when he was a speaker for the California Masonic Symposium at Sacramento. And over the years, I have learned so many things by talking to these two individuals, reading what they write, and thinking through issues that they lay out. So With your permission, I'll share from a written paper today. I often prefer to speak from an outline, but we have translators, and since I do not speak French, I think that reading it today will be preferred so that all those who may have the inability to understand it in English will have an opportunity to do that. As the title was suggested, it's Into the Maelstrom, the issue of Masonic regularity, past and present. The longer paper, which is in print outside, will give you a clearer definition of why I chose that particular title. This is an abridgment of that paper, and there are many issues that I would have liked to touch upon, but in the interest of time, have condensed it to what I'll be sharing with you now. So it is a pleasure to be able to present this paper to the World Conference on Fraternalism, Freemasonry, and History here in Paris. This presentation is based on the longer paper, which will be available after the conference, or I guess is available now. I've titled this paper, Into the Maelstrom, the issue of Masonic regularity, past and present. And it is based not only on my research into the subject, but upon personal experience as the Grand Secretary of the Masonic Grand Lodge of California over some 18 years of handling foreign Masonic relations for our Grand Lodge. Our Grand Lodge does not have a Foreign Relations Committee, and thus it falls to the Grand Secretary to manage the foreign relations of the Grand Lodge on behalf of the Grand Lodge and its current Grand Master. To this experience, I have had the benefit of having served my Grand Lodge, as you heard, last year as Grand Master, with the ultimate responsibility during that year only for foreign relations. And thus, a disclaimer, these opinions are mine alone. They do not reflect the opinion of our current Grand Master or our Grand Lodge, although I would hope that many within our Grand Lodge would find occasion to agree with what I will share. The majority of Grand Lodges in the world consider themselves as belonging to the family of, quote, regular Grand Lodges, close quote. That is to say, Grand Lodges which consider their constitution and regulations to be consistent with those handed down from the premier Grand Lodge, which was formed at London in 1717. As inheritors of that source, the Grand Lodges have developed certain understandings about the nature of Freemasonry, which they share, although, as we shall see, the uniformity of practice which they claim to share is not as uniform as they may like to believe. But these Grand Lodges do share certain common organizational principles which are sufficiently similar that the title regular can fairly be applied to them, and which form the basis for fraternal relations between the several Grand Lodges which make up this family. It is also well known that there are Grand Lodges which adhere to principles which keep them outside the family of regular Grand Lodges, and which are therefore barriers to intervisitation between members of these Grand Lodges and those of the regular family of Freemasonry. Chief amongst those differences is the requirement of some sort of belief in God for members of their lodges, and the requirement that membership be restricted to men only. As we shall see, these fundamental differences may not be as uniformly interpreted in practice as the practical application of these practices has caused and continues to cause a great deal of turmoil in the Masonic world of fraternal relations. That turmoil is the subject of this paper. First, it is important to understand why any of this should matter. If Freemasonry were a different kind of organization, it might not matter if some local versions of an organizational type chose one set of principles for its organizational structure, while others made different choices. The only other social organizations which are divided by fundamental beliefs which restrict interorganizational issues similar to Freemasonry are religious organizations, and for much the same reasons, as this paper will show. Religious organizations, especially religious organizations which comprise the three major monotheistic religions, are characterized by exclusive claims to authenticity. The term authenticity is not often heard in Freemasonry, but it can be fairly claimed that the issues of regularity in Freemasonry are not much different from the issues of authenticity in religious organizations. The major difference is that religions claim to have received their original and authentic beliefs and structures directly from God, while Freemasonry makes no such claim. But Freemasonry, that is to say, Grand Lodges on behalf of Freemasonry, lay claim to a set of principles which they insist are necessary for their form of Freemasonry to be authentic. By definition, any Freemasonry that is not authentic is spurious. And thus arise the arguments between the families of Freemasonry that I've listed. The family of regular Freemasonry claims that the Freemasonry it practices is the only authentic Freemasonry, and that any other form is not authentic, that it is spurious Freemasonry. The practice of civility today often results in these claims to authenticity to be downplayed when in public, and in particular to be laid aside when in one another's company in a public setting. Many Freemasons today consider it to be bad manners to insist that its version of Freemasonry is authentic, while that practiced by others is spurious. But, politeness aside, that is the only conclusion one can make when Grand Lodges will not allow their members to sit in a tiled lodge in another Grand Lodge, nor permit members from those Grand Lodges to sit in their tiled lodges. Politeness and civility are not the same thing as the maintaining of core principles which are dearly held by Grand Lodges of each of the families. The core principle which underlies these issues is one that is infrequently acknowledged by Freemasons, and which rarely, if ever, appears, in my experience, in any discussion of regularity and intervisitation. That is, the principle of the initiatic process itself. I was very pleased when I visited the Museum of Freemasonry yesterday to see that one of the exhibits there clearly identifies Freemasonry as an initiatic society. So it is apparently a shared understanding of this point. Freemasonry is an initiatic society, a fundamental fact which separates it from other social organizations. A Mason begins his or her Masonic life in a Masonic lodge. The initiation is a private concern of the lodge and its members. It is not conducted in public. Before the member is initiated, he or she, as the case may be, has no knowledge of the ceremony through which he or she will pass. Although we know, of course, that our Masonic ceremonies have been publicly known for centuries. Even so, we maintain the important fiction that the initiate has no knowledge of the experience through which he or she will pass in becoming a Mason. Although we like to claim that Freemasonry is not a secret society, but rather a society with certain secrets, that distinction is largely irrelevant when it comes to the initiatic process. The very nature of the initiatic process is its secrecy, and it is from this fundamental principle that the issues of regularity and recognition flow. Every Masonic degree with which I am familiar expects the candidate to make some sort of promise not to divulge the contents of the degree to those who are not similarly entitled to it. When the initiate comes into Freemasonry, he or she naturally assumes that anyone present at the initiation is, as many rituals express it, lawfully entitled to the same. It is only subsequently that the issue of who has a right to be present in the lodge is raised. In the beginning, each lodge made that decision for itself. It would certainly know those in the neighborhood who were or claimed to be Masons, and could rather easily decide if someone not a member of the lodge was entitled to be present at a future initiatic ceremony. But even in the beginning, lodges had to exercise some discretion. We read of leg of mutton, Masons, in the early days of the Premier Grand Lodge at London, who would make someone a Mason for the price of a dinner. This pejorative term indicates that even in the earliest days, our ancestors knew that there was a difference between authentic Mason and spurious Masons. The problem of recognizing someone outside the area as a Mason was originally dealt with by requiring a potential visitor to give some sort of summary of the initiatic ritual so that the lodge could determine if he were an authentic Mason. But the early exposés soon made that identification of a Mason who wished to visit difficult. Grand Lodges, when formed, soon began issuing certificates that their members might carry with them while abroad, certifying to the authenticity of the bearer. And these same Grand Lodges also issued lists of other Grand Lodges which were considered to have authentic lodges and Masons. Thus was born the idea of regularity in Freemasonry and a recognition of the same between Grand Lodges. In the earliest years of what I term corporate recognition, that is, recognition of Masons as a group, more commonly in a Grand Lodge, this was apparently not an issue. But individual regularity was. And this individual regularity hinged on whether the lodge which had made a man a Mason, and I'll say yes, a man in this context, conducted the initiation with a ritual that was recognizable as Masonic in content, and that the initiation was made for a serious purpose. But as Freemasonry matured, other issues rose to the fore. Questions as to which Grand Lodge a lodge belonged to began to surface. The first of these issues, curiously enough, was in England itself, the birthplace of the first Grand Lodge. As we may remember, the ancients rose out of discriminatory practices against Irish Masons in lodges of the Premier Grand Lodge. But the formation of the ancient Grand Lodge, this issue of having been properly made a Mason came to the fore with a vengeance. The modern's Grand Lodge forbade its lodges to receive ancient Masons as visitors, and ancient lodges insisted on remaking modern Masons when affiliating with their lodges. This seems to have been the first consistent application of the notion that some Masons were irregular simply because they became Masons in lodges affiliated with another Grand Lodge. However, the situation did not last very long. It is difficult to control Masons visiting lodges other than their own when friends and relatives are involved. And intervisitation between the modern lodges and ancient lodges is well attested. By the time that the two Grand Lodges unified in 1813, the issues which had originally divided them were largely irrelevant. And such divisions did not seem to exist in the larger world of Freemasonry at the time. As Freemasonry spread around the world and as new Grand Lodges were formed, the issue of intervisitation and the related issue of regularity of those Grand Lodges seemed to have disappeared. That is, it disappeared until Grand Lodges in the United States developed the idea of territoriality. The idea that a Grand Lodge was supreme in a given territory was rather slow in developing. When the issue arose, it generally came out of a specific problem within an existing Grand Lodge, such as the schematic Grand Lodge south of the River Trent in England. But in the United States, the newly independent Grand Lodges in the former English colonies on the East Coast were faced with the problem of whether a new Grand Lodge could come into existence as the United States expanded across the continent. The problem was solved by an informal agreement that new Grand Lodges could be created in any newly organized political territory or state by 3 properly chartered lodges, at least 3, surrendering their charters to their parent Grand Lodges and receiving a charter from the newly formed Grand Lodge in the territory or state. It became a settled principle in the United States that once a Grand Lodge had been formed in a territory or a state, that no outside Grand Lodge could charter a lodge within that territory or state. To do so would be an invasion of territory, and thus was born the idea that a Masonic Grand Lodge must exercise control over all lodges within a given territory, the doctrine of exclusive territorial jurisdiction. This concept is still with us today, and the chartering of a new lodge in a territory occupied by an existing Grand Lodge, or the formation of a rival Grand Lodge in the territory of an existing Grand Lodge, is generally considered to be an irregular act. By the last quarter of the 19th century, another issue had risen to the fore, that of religious belief as a test of regularity in Freemasonry. Early on, the first Grand Lodge had made it clear that Freemasonry, properly understood and practiced, was associated with a belief in God. Anderson's Constitutions of 1723 set forth this understanding in this language. The article concerning God and religion. A Mason is obliged by his tenure to obey the moral law, and if he rightly understands the art, he will never be a stupid atheist nor an irreligious libertine. But though in ancient times Masons were charged in every country to be of the religion of that country or nation, whatever it was, yet 'tis now thought more expedient only to oblige them to that religion in which all men agree, leaving their particular opinions to themselves, that is, to be good men and true, or men of honor and honesty, by whatever denominations or persuasions they may be distinguished, whereby Masonry becomes the center of union and the means of conciliating true friendship among persons that must have remained at a perpetual distance. The ambiguity of the first charge of 1723 has provided endless debate amongst Masons as to the nature of this expectation. And this paper is not the place to discuss all of the implications or disagreements over its interpretation. Suffice it to say that it seems clear, at least to me, that the Premier Grand Lodge, in adopting this statement, is advancing the idea that authentic Freemasonry will teach morality. And if a Freemason understands what is taught, he won't be an atheist or a libertine. Now, we could argue forever as to whether an intelligent atheist should be a Mason or a devout libertine should be one, but I don't think there was much confusion about the nature of Freemasonry as understood in 1723 by the Premier Grand Lodge. Freemasonry may have been at the cutting edge of acceptance and toleration of those with widely differing religious beliefs, but there were some limits beyond which Freemasons could not go without being considered either stupid or irreligious, to use the language of 1723. This position was certainly supported by the rituals of the day, which were replete with references both to Christianity and to God. It would have been difficult to conceive of Freemasonry as an irreligious institution if one were to read those rituals alone. This is something to consider seriously in the continuing debate over whether authentic Freemasonry requires a belief in God. Our earliest rituals assumed that God existed, and it is difficult for me to understand how Freemasonry could ever discard this assumption and still remain true to the spirit of those early rituals. After the initiatic process itself, which I mentioned as the first fundamental principle of authenticity in Freemasonry, The principle of assuming the existence of God, however God might be defined, seems to be an obvious and important part of authentic Freemasonry. However, there remains the question as to whether authentic Freemasonry needs to make that a religious test as a requirement for seeking membership, or whether this can best be left to the expressions in the ritual itself. But that is for future debate and discussion. I will digress at this point to point out that in the original paper, I discussed the fact that differing Grand Lodges that do have some requirement of a belief in God have seemingly widely different variations on what they state. The Grand Lodge of California, for example, requires a belief in a supreme being and the immortality of the soul. That's clear in our rituals, and it's clear in our Constitution. That said, there is no requirement that an applicant has to sign in advance to explain what he means by supreme being. In California, it would be perfectly acceptable in terms of signing an application for someone who believes that God created the world millions of years ago and then left town, basically a deist position. The difficulty is that because ritual is alongside constitutional law in California and really in many Grand Lodges, the candidate who comes to his initiation and as a part of that, as a part of the ceremony, is asked a very serious question. He is asked in whom you put your trust. And if he doesn't answer that properly, then the initiation will not proceed. And so we can have the situation, in fact have had, in which an individual arrives at that point in the ceremony and says, I do not have a trust in God. My belief doesn't include a personal God. To that point, he'd been perfectly honest in what he had represented his beliefs to be, according to our law. But now the ritual demands a personal answer. Often the answer comes back from somebody who's uncertain about it. In whom do you put your trust? The answer is, in my wife. But we quickly prompt him to point out that's not correct. You have to respond in God. I only point that out to mention that on the surface things seem quite simple, but when one gets to look at them as they are applied, there is an ambiguity there which does not necessarily go away. The importance of our early documents in Grand Lodge Freemasonry must next attract our attention. The constitutions of 1723 have already been mentioned, and in this context, it should be mentioned that constitution making seems to be a common characteristic of Freemasonry. Each Grand Lodge adopts rules and regulations to govern itself and its lodges, and there is some agreement that these rules and regulations should not stray too far from the principles enunciated in the 1723 constitutions. But Freemasonry has evolved as an institution since 1723, and it will continue to evolve as new issues arise from our social environment. The constitutions of 1723 themselves reflect an evolution in the craft from operative to speculative masonry. Some of the regulations contained therein clearly refer to an era when Freemasonry was involved with governing stonemasons, guild type of organizations, and some pertain to a modern organization that has nothing to do with building in stone. One example that is illustrative of the problem will be mentioned here: the doctrine of the whole youth. The doctrine of the whole youth. The constitutions of 1723 had these statements. The persons admitted members of a lodge must be good men and true, freeborn, and of mature and discreet age, no bondsmen, no bondmen, no women, no immoral or scandalous men, but of good report. And in addition, these same constitutions have this statement: only candidates may know that no master should take an apprentice unless he has sufficient employment for him, and unless he be a perfect youth, having no maim or defect in his body that may render him incapable of learning the art, or serving his master's lord, and of being made a brother. It is easy to see here that the admixture of operative and speculative masonry. Apprentices and operative mason were, quote, not men of mature and discreet age. They were adolescents who were apprenticed to experienced stonemasons to learn how to shape smooth stones from rough rocks. Although we know that some women were owners of stonemasons' businesses, most women were not stonemasons, simply from the fact that strength was needed to move heavy blocks of stone. And we can certainly understand that a one-armed or crippled man would not be very effective on a building site where the ability to move those same heavy blocks of stone was required. But are these conditions for membership that should survive into modern Freemasonry? If so, why? What maim or defect would render a person, as the Constitution states, incapable of learning the art? Grand Lodges today have partially or completely abandoned the requirement that a member have no maim or defect, and the halt, the lame, and the blind are eligible to become Masons today in most other Grand Lodges. But no women? Within the ranks of regular Freemasonry, women are not permitted to become Masons. One may seriously ask the question, why not? If we are entitled to change some of the conditions of membership, why not this one? Can authentic Freemasonry make a blind man a Mason, or a man who has no arms a Mason, but not make a woman a Mason? If not, why not? This brings us to a further consideration of the nature of authentic Freemasonry. So far, I have suggested two conditions which I consider fundamental to the nature of Freemasonry itself: the preservation of the initiatic process, which includes secrecy of the initiatic ceremonies, however one might define that, and the assumption that the rituals of Freemasonry will teach some type of belief in God, however God might be defined. But when we leave these two principles, we are on more uncertain ground. From the earliest years of Grand Lodge Freemasonry, there has been some association of women in our lodges. The earliest expression seems to have been lodges of adoption here in France, and with the development of the Order of the Eastern Star in the United States, which seems to be its latest incarnation. Now, while these women are not Freemasons in the strict sense that they have experienced Masonic initiation in a Masonic lodge, they are so closely associated with Freemasonry as to raise the serious question as to whether they really are a part of its structure. The same thing might be said of the requirement that a Mason must be of discreet age. The American development of Masonic youth orders for boys and girls raises that question. It is possible to describe Freemasonry so narrowly that it encompasses only Masonic lodges proper and only the 3 degrees of Masonry and nothing else. But I would suggest that it is possible to describe Freemasonry as something larger than just that of what we consider to be the lodge and the now extant degrees of ancient craft masonry. Freemasonry can be defined to include additional rights and degrees with some accuracy, as our conference 2 days ago and yesterday about the Franken manuscripts clearly illustrates. And I believe it can also be defined to include organizations surrounding it, which include women. It may also be appropriate to describe it as including women within its inner circle as well, as some Grand Lodges in the world have decided to do. I would suggest at the very least that this should not be a closed subject for discussion. When reading lists that are published by other Grand Lodges of what they consider to be the characteristics of regular Freemasonry, we come across many variations, or as many variations as Grand Lodges have developed their own lists. Now, from my standpoint, there is no disputing the right of a Grand Lodge to adopt its own conditions for Freemasonry. But whether these are or should be of a universal nature is an entirely different question. One important list is that adopted by the United Grand Lodge of England in 1929. The main paper reproduces all of those in extenso, so you can read those. From that list, I have placed here the ones that I feel are at least worthy of discussion in this context. Let me read what those four are. Number one, regularity of origin. That is, each Grand Lodge shall have been established by a duly recognized Grand Lodge or by 3 or more regularly constituted lodges. Now that's in the text of the basic principles. However, we know that some Grand Lodges came into existence in other ways, and that their origin is in no way disputed. I would suggest that the example of the ancient Grand Lodge in England, a fount of origin for many of our lodges around the world, is a case in point. We don't know where those lodges came from that formed that first Grand Lodge. Number two on their list, that a belief in the grand architect of the universe and his revealed will shall be an essential qualification for membership. Well, reference to the constitutions of many Grand Lodges, including my own Grand Lodge of California, shows a significant difference with this statement, or difference of opinion with this statement. The Grand Lodge of California requires a belief in a supreme being and the immortality of the soul. That is not exactly a belief in his revealed will, as defined by the United Grand Lodge of England. So I suppose by that standard, the Grand Lodge of California is spurious and irregular. That all initiates should take their obligations on or in full view of the open volume of the sacred law, by which is meant the revelation from above, which is binding on the conscience of the particular individual who is being initiated. Well, now, this requirement might be a useful way of demonstrating the adherence of a lodge to the teaching of a belief in God, but there might be equally useful ways of achieving the same objective. While most, if not all, Grand Lodges which call themselves regular have this as a practice, it may be questioned, and I do question it, as to whether or not it is a fundamental principle of authentic Freemasonry. In addition, it has now become common practice to obligate a candidate on the volume of the sacred law, which he considers binding. But a closer inspection of these volumes will disclose a wide variety of attitude toward them. The sacred writings of some religions are not considered by their adherents as a revelation from above. This, of course, begs the question as to whether or not we should consider this practice a fundamental principle of authentic Masonry. I will digress just a moment to tell you a personal story in terms of our Grand Lodge. Our Constitution lists the volumes of the sacred law that a candidate may use to take his obligation. They include, obviously, the Bible or the Jewish Tanakh or the Quran, the Buddhist Tripitaka, Bhagavad Gita of Hinduism are all listed. But there's a clause in there that says that other volumes may be added at the discretion of the Grand Master. In 1998, our then Grand Master decided to add a volume that was the sacred writings of the Gnostic Catholic Church, which is the twin of the OTO, or the Order of the Oriental Temple in English. The book was authored by Aleister Crowley. We kept that as an alternative volume of the sacred law until 2004, when our then Grand Master decided to remove it. I bring this up as a point by saying that it is not necessarily totally clear what one would mean by this. We have had Masons in California asked to be obligated on blank books, on books that are not normally considered to be religious in nature, because they consider them to be that which binds them in taking an obligation. An example in my mind of things that seem clear at the outset, but really are far from it when one has to take a closer look. Number 7 from the list. I listed the first 3, but I'll list number 7 now. That the discussion of religion and politics within the lodge shall be strictly prohibited. That's from the 1929 Basic Principles. Well, if this is a fundamental requirement, what do we mean by religion? What do we mean by politics? why do we consider this requirement of authentic Freemasonry to be fundamental? And what do we mean by the phrase within a lodge? Can we discuss religion and politics at the non-tiled festive board after lodge is closed? If not, why not? Are Freemasons forbidden to express religious or political views to one another privately and away from the premises of the lodge? Are there any Masonic principles that would govern such expression of religious or political views? I've raised these questions to show that, in my opinion, the issues of regularity in Freemasonry are not as easily established as some would think. The paper upon which this presentation rests has a lot further elaboration of this subject, and I would refer you to it. But in summary, I would suggest that we have found ourselves in the unfortunate position of having closed off all discussion and dialogue on the subject. Such a position is not consistent with the nature of Freemasonry itself, which is supposed to be a search for truth. I believe the time has come to raise these issues. The world of Freemasonry is in a time of great change. We need to address that change if we are to be true to our commitment to truth. And an intelligent and informed dialogue between the streams of Freemasonry is important for our future as an organization. If not us, then who? If not now, then when? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cooper. Now, Mr. Boer, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you very much, John. I will try to use my French accent instead, if you don't mind. Je voulais d'abord remercier John, parce qu'effectivement, il y a 15 ans, il a eu le courage d'organiser le symposium maçonnique de Californie, non seulement avec le Grand Orient, mais aussi plus tard avec la Grande Loge féminine ou le droit humain, ce qui était révolutionnaire à plusieurs titres. Saluer Alain de Kegel, que j'ai vu tout à l'heure, qui fut le premier initiateur du dialogue avec nos amis américains, un dialogue franc, honnête, sans mensonge. Et puis Paul Rich pour avoir eu l'idée, la volonté, avec quelques-uns, d'organiser ce colloque qui se traduit dans une logique à la fois de présentation des manuscrits, d'ouverture du musée de la franc-maçonnerie, et l'année prochaine, dans ces mêmes lieux, entre avril et juillet, de la plus grande exposition maçonnique que la France aura connue. D'abord, je voulais lui dire qu'avec son autorisation, j'avais un immense désaccord avec la première phrase de son intervention. Je ne crois pas qu'il y ait un maelstrom de la régularité. Je pense que la régularité, c'est plutôt la mer morte. Elle est très salée, elle baisse à vue d'œil, y plonger est extrêmement désagréable, ça brûle, ça pique et ça fait mal, c'est joli à regarder, mais de loin, mais il n'y se passe rien. La régularité, comme pourrait le dire très bien Roger Daché dans un ouvrage qu'il va publier d'ici quelques jours et qui méritera d'être traduit en anglais, c'est d'abord une immense confusion et une absence totale de compréhension de ce que les mots veulent dire. Il dit que c'est un faux ami, et moi je dirais plutôt que c'est un vrai ennemi. La régularité, c'est grosso modo la banalité. What is regular in English? C'est quelque chose qui n'a rien de particulier ni de spécial. C'est ce qui est normal. C'est une banale normalité. Et cette banale normalité est à géométrie extraordinairement variable. Pour prendre une histoire grand orientale, comme dirait de Kegel, nous n'avons pas rompu avec nos amis anglais en 1877. On n'a pas rompu avec les Anglais à cause du droit ou du fait qu'il fallait croire ou pas croire au grand architecte de l'univers ou à l'immortalité de l'âme. D'abord parce que c'est arrivé tardivement au Grand Orient. Avant 1849, cette question ne se posait pas. Et en 1877, elle ne se posait pas plus, puisque nous avions déjà rompu avec les Britanniques en 1776, 100 ans avant, sur 3 sujets essentiels, le cœur de la question. Et je peux vous le dire, le cœur de la question n'était ni Dieu, ni les femmes. Le cœur de la question était petit 1, qui sait les plus anciens. Et la Grande Loge de Londres estimait que quand même, nous devrions reconnaître son antériorité. Je dois le dire d'ailleurs, mes prédécesseurs, pris d'un moment de fierté nationale et de gaulocentrisme, se sont crus autorisés à contester cette antériorité. Je pense qu'ils avaient tort, même si fondamentalement nous aurions dû reconnaître, par esprit d'indépendance nationale et de reconnaissance historique, nos amis écossais, ce qui aurait pu être drôle. Ils n'avaient peut-être pas totalement tous le sens de l'humour. Deuxièmement, il y avait eu la création d'une loge que nous avions reconnue dans les Pays-Bas autrichiens, nous appelons ça, je crois, aujourd'hui la Belgique, et les Anglais et les Français se contestaient mutuellement le droit de reconnaître une loge sur un territoire hors secteur, mais qui n'avait pas fait l'objet d'une pré-autorisation initiale au vu de la charte ou de la patente originelle. Et troisièmement, ce qui agaçait vraiment beaucoup nos amis anglais, c'est l'aide, l'assistance, le financement et l'envoi de cargaisons d'armes et de soutien qui étaient envoyés et organisés au siège du Grand Orient pour aider les insurgents américains. Ces 3 motifs ont semblé suffisants, et je dois dire que je comprends les Anglais, pour créer les conditions d'une rupture immédiate des relations diplomatiques entre le Grand Orient de France et la Grande Loge d'Angleterre, qui n'étaient pas encore unies. Point. Elles n'ont jamais été rétablies. Jamais. Une tolérance, simplement, permettait aux loges anglaises de recevoir des frères français et aux frères et aux loges françaises de recevoir des frères anglais. Et tout le monde s'en contentait fort bien. Quand il y a eu réunification en 1813, puis les Principles de 1929, puis les commentaires sur les Principles, puis les commentaires des commentaires, puis les interprétations des commentaires, nous avons vu apparaître une formidable régularité à géométrie variable, qui est le cœur du problème qu'a très bien illustré John. Nous avons donc eu à faire face au chaos et au désordre, mais qui est marqué par un problème maçonnique consubstantiel à la France, en général, en particulier, qui est la sissiparité compulsive du maçon, qui se traduit à la fois par des objectifs ritueliques et par des outils obédientiels. Cette maladie naturelle a évidemment compliqué les choses. Elle a été résolue par le monopole continental aux États-Unis, encore que, et par la diversité des parcours maçonniques dans les pays de type France, Belgique et autres qui ont eu une pratique beaucoup plus libérale. Pourtant, quand on y regarde un peu à fond, au-delà de la question sémantique sur est-ce que régulier, ça veut bien dire ce que ça veut dire, et nous savons très clairement que ça ne veut pas dire ce que nous imaginons, on se rend compte de la puissance culturelle du terme. En 2000, quand je me suis trouvé en situation de prendre des fonctions provisoires de CDD de grand maître au Grand Orient, j'ai été stupéfait de voir à la bibliothèque du Grand Orient, chez Pierre Mollier, une série d'anciens diplômes. Parce que grand maître a toujours envie de refaire l'esthétique du diplôme. C'est une sorte de marque de fabrique. Il est passé par là, il a laissé quelque chose. Soit il refait le rituel, soit il refait les diplômes. Moi, j'ai pu refaire tout. Les anciens diplômes parlaient du Grand Orient de France comme puissance symbolique, régulière, souveraine. Jusque dans les années 40. Puis à partir des années 50, le régulier a été supprimé par le Grand Orient tout seul. il s'était auto-convaincu de son irrégularité. Puisque tout le monde lui disait qu'il ne l'était pas, c'est qu'il ne l'était pas. Un beau matin de Conseil de l'Ordre, après consultation avec Roger Daché et Pierre Mollier, qui nous ont raconté une histoire formidable sur l'inventivité de l'existence de la patente qui n'existe en fait jamais, nous avons décidé de remettre régulier sur les diplômes. Conseil de l'Ordre, dans un mouvement d'humeur et parce qu'il aimait bien le grand maître, a décidé que pourquoi pas. Nous avons réimprimé des diplômes. Les diplômes ont retrouvé puissance symbolique régulière souveraine, les tampons, les affiches, les sceaux. Et personne ne s'en est jamais rendu compte. Il avait disparu dans l'indifférence, il est réapparu dans l'indifférence. Parce que l'élément majeur qui porte la question de la régularité, c'est qu'elle n'existe comme question maçonnique que par l'inculture de ceux qui la discutent. Tous ceux qui ont une vague culture historique de cette question savent que c'est un outil purement politique. Ils s'en foutent. Tous ceux qui n'ont aucune idée de ce que c'est pensent que c'est très très important et très 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 grave. C'est une sorte de maladie d'adolescent dégénérative. Ça sort comme des boutons. Quand on ne les soigne pas, ça disparaît. Quand on les soigne, ça laisse des marques. Et donc, nous avons des marqueurs maçonniques qui sont l'importance accordée ou pas accordée à cette question terrifiante de la régularité. En fait, il n'y a pas plus de question de la régularité qu'il n'y a de beurre en branche, et la recherche de la régularité perdue est une démarche aussi intéressante que le 18e volume du Harrison Ford de série. C'est bien, c'est joli, c'est intéressant, il y a des jolies images, il y a de moins en moins de scénarios, il y a de plus en plus de mise en scène et de création numérisée, mais grosso modo, on s'y perd. Ce que John nous démontre, c'est que la question de la régularité, c'est une question politico-diplomatique sur le contrôle du territoire. Et le plus simple, c'est d'aller voir ce qui se passe chez les autres, plutôt que de nous poser des questions sur nous-mêmes. Nous avons la diversité des parcours, la question de Dieu a été à peu près résolue, la question des femmes, fort heureusement aussi, tardivement, il faut le reconnaître, que de ce point de vue-là, nous n'avons pas éclairé l'univers, mais disons que le sujet a été à peu près traité. Il reste aujourd'hui quelques curiosités. John, dans son papier complet, dit « Je pourrais vous parler de la situation de Basse-Californie, qui est un État du Mexique, où la Grande Loge officielle a scissionné en deux, mais où la Grande Loge scissionnée a survécu, et où à la fin, ils ont décidé de reconnaître les deux. On peut vous parler de tas d'exceptions à la règle de la régularité. Car qui n'a jamais assisté à une conférence des grands maîtres où le secrétaire de la commission de la reconnaissance se réunit pour faire état des règles de base et des exceptions à la règle de base, puis des retours à l'exception, puis des confirmations de l'exception, puis des exceptions à l'exception, n'a jamais rien vu de ce que peut être une vraie réunion maçonnique. Pour avoir assisté une fois à la conférence des grands maîtres américains en invité de marque extrêmement respecté et tout irrégulier que j'étais, car à l'époque, il y avait beaucoup plus irrégulier que moi, ce qui m'avait recentré, on peut constater que cette question est extrêmement souple. Elle peut se tordre de manière extrêmement simple. La régularité, elle n'a d'importance que quand on lui en donne. Accompagné par Alain de Kegel, un jour, je me suis rendu en visite très officielle, mais un peu discrète quand même, mais en ne rentrant pas par la porte de derrière, ce qui était un progrès. La fois d'avant, un de mes prédécesseurs était passé par l'entrée des poubelles, je crois, ce qui terrorisait un peu Alain, qui pensait quand même qu'on pouvait faire mieux. Nous avons monté les marches et nous sommes entrés dans l'immeuble d'une très grande institution américaine, le Suprême Conseil Juridiction Sud, et nous avons rencontré d'éminents hiérarques. Et à un moment, par un hasard de la vie, je tombe sur un des plus éminents hiérarques, qui n'était pas exactement prévu dans la réunion, mais qui se trouvait par là, qui demande ce que je fais là. Nous papotons, nous avions visiblement un certain nombre d'orientations professionnelles communes. Et qui me dit « Bon, et alors, c'est quoi votre sujet ?» Bon, je dis « On va parler un peu de la régularité. » Et à ce moment-là, il me prend avec un air de vieux sage parlant à un jeune enfant turbulent et me dit « Tu sais, Alain, vous pardonnerez mon anglais, regularity is bullshit. » Ce jour-là, une illumination s'est faite dans mon esprit. J'ai enfin compris l'immense intelligence et l'exceptionnelle souplesse de nos frères américains, qui avaient compris que le problème essentiel n'était pas du tout de savoir si on devait être régulier ou pas régulier, mais de savoir avec qui ils avaient envie ou pas envie de travailler, à condition qu'on ne leur casse pas trop les pieds. C'est-à-dire que tous ceux qui ne leur posaient pas la question de la régularité étaient les bienvenus pour faire à peu près tout ce qu'ils voulaient, et tous ceux qui leur posaient la question de « s'il vous plaît, reconnaissez-vous, reconnaissez-nous », leur posaient des problèmes insurmontables parce que même s'ils nous aimaient beaucoup, ils n'étaient pas prêts pour autant à se fâcher avec les Anglais. Une fois qu'on a compris ça, la question de la maçonnerie, c'est quoi ? La relation entre des frères et des sœurs, le fait de pouvoir travailler en loge, le fait d'être présent et le fait d'avoir la possibilité de se rencontrer lors de réunions, colloques, conférences, cérémonies, qui nous intéressent dans la chaleur de la fraternité. Le reste, à part ceux qui ont vocation à devenir grands maîtres, et ils sont nombreux, et ceux qui ont vocation à le rester, ils le sont encore plus, et ceux qui ont du mal à oublier qu'ils l'ont été, mais qu'ils ne le sont plus. Et c'est une maladie contre laquelle il faut se battre tous les jours. Ça n'intéresse quand même personne de savoir si on est reconnu ou pas. Roger et moi, et quelques autres ici, Alain par exemple, ont été accueillis en tant que frères dans des tenues, tout ce qu'il y a de plus tenu, bon, avec des éléments qu'on ne maîtrise pas tout à fait, comme le sermon du chapelain et deux, trois éléments qui nous paraissent un peu bizarres, mais qui semblent être le cœur du rituel, sans que ceci ne pose de problème à qui que ce soit, dès lors qu'on ne le fait pas remarquer. Eh bien, la question est extrêmement simple. Le débat sur la régularité est en fait limité à notre capacité à accueillir des frères ou des sœurs parce qu'ils sont des frères ou des sœurs et que nous les reconnaissons comme tels. Et c'est à peu près la seule règle de régularité qui aurait un peu de sens. Et puis, il y a quelques curiosités. Parce que John Cooper, il est poli. Il pose des questions, il s'interroge, et les femmes dans tout ça, et comment on parle de Dieu, est-il un supreme being, ou est-il un Dieu avec un will revealed? Comment on prend ces choses-là? Mais la vraie question, elle n'est pas là. Combien il y a de grandes loges régulières dans les États américains qui n'accueillent toujours pas de Noirs, de Latinos, qui se poseraient la question d'accueillir un Juif? Il y en a. Et cette question n'a rien à voir avec Dieu. Elle a à voir avec la ségrégation. Elle a à voir avec l'intolérance. Elle a à voir avec l'irrégularité absolue, non pas des principes, mais des valeurs qui font la maçonnerie. Et cette question-là, elle n'est pas résolue dans le sud, une partie du sud des États-Unis. S'il y a des grandes loges régulières extrêmement éclairées, ce qui est le cas par exemple de la Californie, il y en a d'autres qui n'ont toujours pas dépassé le péristyle de l'entrée du temple et dont les règles mêmes de l'initiation sont la négation de ce qui est le texte fondateur de 1723, pour ne prendre que celui-ci. Texte d'ailleurs qui, dans ces deux versions, 23 et 39, règle beaucoup des problèmes que nous nous posons. Si en 1723, la question de Dieu est mise à la porte du temple, je le rappelle, en 1738, elle est mise au cœur du temple et dans une version qu'il faut savoir lire avec les yeux du lecteur de l'époque. D'abord, on rend hommage à la liberté de conscience. Ça voulait dire qu'on pouvait avoir une religion, mais celle qu'on voulait, ce qui revient au débat actuel sur qu'est-ce qu'une religion et comment ça se classe. La deuxième, c'est que ce texte était à la gloire non pas des chrétiens, mais des Noachites. Noachites, c'est les enfants de Noé. Alors, Noé, je dois dire, moi, c'est un maçon qui me plaît bien. Il est à la fois amphibie et mixte. Il prenait tout par paire. Il avait en fait résolu l'essentiel du débat, à la fois sur la survivance au flot et sur le fait que les femmes, donc les sœurs, étaient parfaitement les bienvenues, ne serait-ce que pour préserver l'avenir de l'humanité. Il y a donc un certain nombre de sujets qu'on pourrait traiter, si ce n'est par l'humour, en tout cas par l'histoire. En fait, au jour d'aujourd'hui, le débat sur la régularité n'est qu'un débat diplomatique. il se résout non pas par des choix sur les contenus, la règle 1, la règle 23, la règle 29, d'abord elles ont beaucoup changé, il y en a qu'on a oubliés, il y a des éléments intermédiaires, 1751, après 1929, il y a aussi 1951, bref, à peu près à chaque réunion de la conférence des Grandes Loges ou de la Grande Loge d'Angleterre, désormais unie, on voit arriver des principes de reconnaissance, de déreconnaissance, de suspension de la reconnaissance, de re-reconnaissance, d'exception à la reconnaissance. Il faut lire les proceedings détenus de Grandes Loges britanniques, c'est quand même un pur moment de bonheur et je pense qu'on devrait les traduire en français plus souvent. Moi, je voudrais terminer en disant, il me semble qu'il y a deux manières de résoudre ce problème. Je vais proposer la manière anglo-saxonne. La régularité, c'est article 1, ce que Londres décide. Et article 2, en cas de doute, revoir l'article 1. Et du point de vue continental, je vous propose une solution beaucoup plus simple, qui d'ailleurs a été celle d'une obédience qui a été créée en France il y a assez longtemps, la Grande Loge traditionnelle et symbolique Opéra, qui a dit, écoutez, on va faire simple, la régularité, c'est quand un maçon libre rejoint une loge libre, qui librement se fédère dans une obédience libre. Ça me paraît être un bon résumé qui pourrait parfaitement éclairer le prochain symposium de la Grande Loge de Californie. Merci.
Thank you to our speakers today, and I'm sure that the audience has many questions related to these very interesting presentations. Any questions from the audience? Please let us know so we can identify. Daniel, Dr. Doche. Merci. Hello. So while we wait, I just wanted to mention some key things that I see in terms of the issue of regularity that have to be with this, that is a complex situation in which, I mean, according to the speakers, it shouldn't be that complicated. So it's a complex situation, but shouldn't be that complicated. But let's hear the...
First of all, I would like to thank our American brethren to organize an American convention in Paris. And as it is in Paris, I will speak in French.
Oh, bien.
Je voudrais simplement intervenir sur un tout petit point technique, mais qui est au cœur en partie des deux interventions. Je serai très bref, mais ça me paraît très important. Il faudra un jour qu'on écrive peut-être un livre sur cette question. Il y a une légende dans l'historiographie, me semble-t-il, il y a une légende dans l'historiographie maçonnique qui est qu'il existe une rupture fondamentale entre le titre premier de l'édition de 1738 des Constitutions d'Anderson et celle de 1723. En quelques mots, pour reprendre l'expression d'Alain Boer il y a un instant, je ne pense pas qu'on puisse dire strictement que les constitutions de 1723 mettent Dieu à la porte du temple. Elles mettent l'appartenance religieuse à la porte du temple, ce qui est un tout petit peu différent. Et la version de 1738 n'est pas un rétrécissement de 1723, parce que quand on regarde la version de 1723, elle parle des différentes dénominations. Alors vous savez que ça c'est un faux ami en français, hein. On dit dénomination, façon d'appeler. Non, denomination, en anglais, ça signifie une confession religieuse, une église particulière. Et donc ça veut dire quelle que soit l'église particulière et la confession à laquelle on appartient, ce qui suppose qu'on appartienne à une église ou à une confession, quelle qu'elle soit. Or, l'édition de 1738 parle des noachites, c'est-à-dire qu'elle réfère à une époque qui est antérieure, évidemment, aux confessions et aux dénominations. Et c'est d'ailleurs dans l'édition de 1738 et pas dans l'édition de 1723 qu'apparaît l'expression « liberté de conscience », cette expression étant naturellement entendue à la manière anglo-saxonne, c'est-à-dire liberté absolue de choisir son appartenance religieuse. Donc, premier point, il ne faut pas dire, contrairement à ce que... parce que la légende de cette interprétation en France a été pour la première fois formulée par Oswald Wirth, dont la mémoire est respectable, mais qui a commis quand même beaucoup de contresens et a été reprise après lui en France par de nombreux auteurs. Premièrement, je ne pense pas que l'édition de 1738 soit un rétrécissement de celle de 1723. Mais surtout, Ce qu'on oublie souvent de dire, c'est qu'au XVIIIe siècle, en Angleterre, il y a eu 2 autres éditions des constitutions avant l'édition de 1815 qui suit l'Union de 1813. C'est l'édition de 1756 par Hentix et l'édition de 1784 par Northcote. Eh bien, allez voir dans ces éditions qu'aucun auteur français ne cite jamais. Le titre premier qui a été repris, c'est le texte de 1723. Ce qui veut dire que le texte de 1738 n'est pas une avancée dans la négation de la liberté d'appartenance religieuse vers le dogmatisme triomphant de l'édition de 1815. Je pense simplement, et je me termine là-dessus, que ce débat est hypertrophié dans les pays de tradition catholique. Et d'ailleurs, ça n'est pas un hasard si la maçonnerie dite libérale et adogmatique prédomine dans les pays de tradition catholique, alors que la maçonnerie dite régulière prédomine dans les pays de tradition protestante. Tout simplement parce que la question de l'appartenance religieuse, la question de la définition du contenu de la foi est quelque chose de beaucoup plus compliqué, de beaucoup plus agressif, de beaucoup plus impérieux dans les pays de tradition catholique que dans les pays de tradition protestante, qui ont fait du libre examen le principe de la vie religieuse. Et je pense que cette question du problème religieux est un problème, notamment dans les pays européens continentaux, parce qu'il y a une inculture profonde sur la nature de l'appartenance religieuse, en particulier dans le contexte de l'Angleterre du début du XVIIIe siècle. Ça montre simplement, et je termine là-dessus, ça montre simplement que l'inculture historique et l'inculture religieuse relative à une situation vieille de 3 siècles continuent de parasiter la compréhension du phénomène maçonnique aujourd'hui dans le monde. Pour le reste, naturellement, si on évacue ou si on relativise cette question, je partage tout à fait les conclusions croisées, quoique légèrement différentes, qui ont été présentées par John Cooper et Alain Boer.
Non, je veux dire que j'appartiens à la catégorie de ceux qui pensent que les constitutions de 1738 sont beaucoup plus intéressantes que celles de 1723 et qu'elles ont été un vrai progrès pour les 2 raisons, la liberté de conscience comme paraphe dédicace de la première page et sur la partie des noachites, parce que le noachitisme ouvre des perspectives beaucoup plus intéressantes que la partie de Dieu et de la religion, qui était le titre mal traduit d'ailleurs, qui permettait de ne parler ni de l'un ni de l'autre à l'intérieur du texte. Donc je n'ai pas de désaccord quant à l'inculture historique et là un effet maçonnique. Voilà. Ensuite, appartenant moi aussi en partie à la RPR, c'est-à-dire étant un prétendument réformé comme Roger, ce salut à la fois au libre examen et au côté un peu verkrampft du protestantisme quand il s'applique à la maçonnerie m'est allé droit au cœur.
Yes, I might just comment on that. I certainly recognize that there will be differences of opinion as we look at these historic documents, and I respect that. I'm aware of the later versions before the Union of 1813 of those. I've often thought over time that one should ask oneself a serious question. How does a Mason paint a floor? And the answer to that is a serious question. How does a Mason paint a floor? And the answer to that is he begins at the door and paints himself into a corner. Now, in encouraging dialogue and discussion of these issues, I think in all seriousness that it is an important thing to be avoided. My good brother Alain Bauer has shared his thoughts that the issues, if we simply did not take them with the seriousness that some people take them and let them disappear of their own accord, would be a useful way to go. And I can understand that. There are many issues within Freemasonry that's happened with. The doctrine of the perfect youth, to me, is a clear example. It is a non-issue. If I tell a young Mason in California, that a Vietnam veteran coming home with one arm in 1964 could not become a Mason in California, they don't believe me. But it was true. We changed our law because our understanding of what Freemasonry was and what society is has changed. What I'm simply urging is that we engage in a serious dialogue to try to look at the issues, to try to understand them, and to try to reach places where we can agree that they are unimportant issues, or we find some way of respecting one another's interpretation of them. I wish that the world were simple for me, simply say that declaring an issue irrelevant would make it go away. Having been involved in Freemasonry in the United States for 50 years last year, I don't think it is as simple as that for American Freemasonry. And even if a jurisdiction such as the United Grand Lodge of England disappeared tomorrow, American Freemasonry would still be dealing with these issues, rightly or wrongly. And what I was urging in the paper is that we find a way to get it out of the scholarship area, which I consider to be extremely important, and into the area of formal dialogue amongst our various Masonic entities. By doing that, we'll not only begin to understand each other better and to listen to one another better, but we also may discover that we have far more agreement in some areas that we never thought would be possible.
Thank you. Thank you. We run out of time, but thank you, Dr. Cooper. Thank you, Mr. Boer. And I would like you to ask for your patience, and I would like to ask our distinguished panel to join me we are going to change the format because we think that this works better if we do it here. We're going to give the second award, the Regulus Award for Distinguished Service at this conference. And the Regulus Awards goes to the book, The Secret School of Wisdom, The Authentic Rituals and Doctrines of the Illuminati, edited by Joseph Wages and Reinhard Margner, and translated with the contribution of Jiva Singh Agnand. This is a pioneering text, a full working manual of the order of the Illuminati, and an outstanding insight into the world's most intriguing secret society. It's a groundbreaking text. It marks the first time that a comprehensive ritual book for the society has been reassembled. Much of this material has never been published, let alone translated into English. Supplemental texts are included to gain further historical insights into the order, and all the documents have been checked for accuracy within the original archival text. So these books gives us, for the first time, reliable information, what has been a myth in popular literature and all over the social media, and those open up new possibilities for research. So I would like to invite Joseph Wages and Reinhard Margner to get, if you can, John, get the certificate from our distinguished guest. Congratulations. Now we have a little coffee break, and then we reconvene in the three different small auditoriums at 3:45. Thank you very much.